Welcome, and thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Maritza Grooms, and I'm here with UML professor Robert Forrant on our show History in Lowell, and today we have a special guest, Cheryl Hamilton from the International Institute of New England. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us. So we've been talking about refugees and immigrants for the last 200 years. Well, not us talking about the last 200
Yeah, well, I'm old, but thank
now
you for that.
We've come up to the present now. So Bob, can you give us like a quick recap on everything that we've talked about? No.
Lowell immigration history in 45 seconds. So when we started, we first started talking about the Irish immigrants coming into the city, and then we followed with French Canadians, Greeks, Portuguese, all the way up through to the present people from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, etc. And one of the hallmarks of all of it, and not necessarily in a good way, was this sort of antagonism towards immigrants. And then in the 70s and 80s, as Southeast Asians started coming in, a definite antagonism as the population first started settling in the city. So one of the things that we did stress is that while the city is welcoming in many ways, it's sort of like a love-hate kind of a welcoming. We like you in certain ways, but we don't necessarily like you in other ways. If you come in small numbers, maybe it's okay. But if it looks like you know, a number of people are coming, then things get very tense. And certainly that was the case with the Cambodian refugee population coming into the city post the end of the Vietnam War. And so we talked about that, and as well then we talked about the efforts on the part of the federal government at different intervals to actually try to curtail immigration. So again, while part of the US history mythology in a way is that we were always a welcoming immigrant country, and we always wanted people to come in, actually on several different occasions we tried to keep people out. In the 1880s we passed laws to keep people from Asian countries out, China in particular. In the late 1890s, we started creating literacy and other tests for people coming in. In 1924, a very harsh Immigration Restriction Act, which pretty much curtailed almost all immigration coming into the city of Lowell from southern and eastern Europe. It was very targeted. And then we sort of finished up with 1965, and there's an Immigration Reform Act, which lifts the quotas and the restrictions from 1924, and that sort of brought us up to where we are right now in the country and in Lowell too. And I did that in 58 seconds. That's pretty good.
Impressive. Yes. I think that you recap literally about 8 episodes.
Yeah, I know.
Well, you're not a distinguished professor for nothing, right?
Yeah.
And we know that once the quota was lifted, it revitalized, we saw a revitalization in cities like Lowell and other mill cities around, because people were starting to come back, and they were bringing job opportunities with them as well because of the high growth industries that were starting to be here, like the tech industries and things like that.
Right. I mean, there's no question but that a city like Lowell or a city like Worcester or some cities up in Maine and New Hampshire, for example, had their economic vitality, their cultural vitality re-energized as new waves of immigrants come in, and as certainly over the last couple or 3 decades, more and more refugees have come in and been settled in places which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go on in the program. And so I don't think not right politically, but any right-thinking person in their head could discount the fact that absent recent immigration into the city of Lowell and the refugee populations that have settled in since the late 70s, early 80s, the city would not be the kind of vital place that I think it is, at least today.
Now, when we talk about resettling immigrants and refugees, we can't discredit or discount the International Institute that's been around for almost 100 years, right, since 1919, I believe.
So we were founded in 1919 here in Lowell originally. At the time, it was the International. It's gone through iterations, but over the last century, we've expanded. So the International Institute of New England today is a 3-site operation. We're based in Boston, Lowell, Massachusetts, and Manchester, New Hampshire. And collectively, we work with about 2,000 foreign-born residents every year, including a percentage of them are refugees. So here in Lowell, we've been, obviously, I mean, the U.S., just like Lowell, has been welcoming refugees for decades. But the formal refugee program that we administer actually comes under the Refugee Act of 1980 that began to actually have this sort of partnership with nonprofit organizations and the State Department and the Department of Housing and Services to bring refugees to communities across the United States. And we're one of those affiliates that are responsible for that program. Now, 40 years later, we're continuing to serve that role. And annually, things have changed. As everybody knows, this was a really complicated year, but we usually would resettle about 200, 250 refugees annually into Lowell.
Wow.
With the reduction at the federal level, it's going to be about 100 this coming year.
Oh, that's so fortunate.
Yeah.
Now, you said in the last 40 years, and that's kind of where we left off. Could you tell us maybe who was coming in the last 40 years?
Sure. I
Not
was
to put
prepped
you
for
on the
10,
spot.
but we'll expand. Well, the interesting thing is that just a little bit of political background. So when the refugee program was originally the formal one under Refugee Act of 1980, it was really our political interests in the world. So making a statement of, towards communism or whatnot. So you had a lot of people from the Eastern Bloc. You have a lot of people from, Cambodia areas and such. In the 1990s, under President Clinton, the resettlement program was sort of re-examined, and what was suggested was if you're only 1% of the world's refugees will ever get resettled, it should prioritize those that need it more than anybody else. So it really should be from a humanitarian perspective. That multiplied the number of countries participating in the program, which I think is the right thing. And it prioritized people like unaccompanied minors who had lost contact with their parents, people with physical or mental disabilities that couldn't be served in the circumstances where they were. I have a good friend that worked in a camp in Kenya that there was a number of people who were blind, for example, that weren't able to get access to services, so they needed extra attention. People who are torture survivors, women at risk, and others. And theoretically, even now, 20 years later, what we try to do internationally is say that 1% should come from wherever there are refugees. So what that did to the whole U.S. program was radically diversify the people coming in very quickly. So now we have people literally from every area of the world. We've got Somalis and Congolese and Burundis and Ethiopians, and then in the Middle East we've got Syrians and Iraqis and Afghanis. We've got Bhutanese and Burmese. I mean, literally it's a collection of folks. In our office we call it the United Nations. In the last decade, though, I'll speak most recently, the myth is that people think it's all like Syrians and Iraqis, but actually Congolese is our largest arrival.
Oh, wow.
And that's because the United States made a commitment a few years ago to resettle 25,000 Congolese across the United States. And so that drew every agency had to participate in that program. So we have about 50% of our arrivals have been from Congo.
Oh, wow, I didn't even know. And I imagine that there's something going on there that's brought them here.
Yeah, so one of the things about the perception of refugee resettlement is it happens really quickly. You see a war in Syria and you say, oh, we must be welcoming Syrians. It actually takes 2 to 4 years to get through the process. But more disturbing is that the time of people living in exile is actually an average of 15 to 17 years.
Wow.
And the Congolese is a perfect example of that. The Congolese war has been going on for 26 years in the eastern part of the Congo, and they've been looking for stabilization literally for decades. So the people that we've been resettling in Lowell, some of them have been displaced for 10 years, growing up in camps in Burundi or Uganda or even further up in Kenya, just hoping that their country will stabilize. And in the absence of that, looking for some way to, like all of us, have access to jobs and education and such. And resettlement is one of those programs that allows people to rebuild their lives.
Wow. And that's something that we've seen with just about every refugee group escaping some kind of turmoil that's going on, that they didn't control a displacement that has happened in their lives. That was at the mercy of someone else with a lot more power.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the growing numbers, right? I mean, the population living either in refugee camps or in their own country, but displaced from wherever they had lived. A huge portion of that has resulted in the last several years with the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, widening that into Syria. And some people would make the argument that the U.S. should actually escalate the numbers of people it's taking, because in several instances the conflicts are things that we either precipitated or became part of, and the displacements were as a consequence of some of our foreign policy ventures, whether people agree or disagree with them. One of the casualties of those conflicts has been internal displacement and or people fleeing completely into another place and then settling in these camps. And these are not luxury hotel accommodations where people are living in these camps as well. So when Cheryl says they've been there for 15, 18, 20 years, and in a lot of cases kids are born in those camps and the camp is their life, I mean, we're talking about real extraordinarily difficult situations.
Even the word camp can
yeah, camp sounds like...
it can create the wrong image. I mean, you're talking about, I worked in a camp that had 80,000 people, and that's a small camp. I mean, in some situations, we're talking about 600,000, 800,000 residents. It's cities that have been just, built to serve this, humanitarian crisis that we're managing in the world. And so in our way, Lowell is participating as an actor in trying to be a partner in providing protection for people worldwide.
Wow.
And in turn, like you said, I hate to say, we don't benefit from it, but as actors in it, when refugees come here, they contribute tremendously. We see all of our community, they have to get to work very quickly. The refugee resettlement program is a very lean government program. People have misperceptions of what refugees receive. It used to be back in 1980 when the program was created, it was 36 months of training and education and financial assistance. Now the federal government provides about 90 days of assistance, and so people have to get to work within months in order to pay for their apartments and their food and all the services we all need. And our clients do that. They literally arrive day one, regardless of their skills, background, or language abilities. They're like, they want to stabilize. And and you can see that represented in the city. You just walk around town. There's Iraqi restaurants and Cambodian restaurants and Vietnamese. That is the history of Lowell and something we celebrate.
Which is pretty miraculous given all of the other information that you just gave us.
Yeah.
Coming from even 5, 10, 15 years on one of these camps to come here and have to resettle in 90 days. That cannot be easy for anybody. Yeah. And I feel like we have college students who can't even get on their feet.
Yeah, it takes freshmen a whole year and they still don't know. They still don't know what's up.
Yeah.
So there you go. I'm glad you brought that up. Not me, but anyway,
there's no question. Our clients just are unbelievably inspiring, and people sometimes you'll hear stereotypes. Refugees have no skills or background. I'm sorry. To survive war itself is a skill, and to persevere under incredible hardship and be creative. Many of our African clients, I used to work in Kenya, and they would start small businesses in the neighborhoods they were in order to be able to afford money to pay for food or housing. So they're entrepreneurial by spirit, and you see that continue here when they come to the U.S.
And even facing that kind of antagonism here in the U.S., that kind of anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment of no, and the thing that we've been talking about this whole time, no, don't come here and with your war background or with your religion and your different languages. So God forbid you speak a different language. But, we have a great organization here that's helping these people get on their feet.
We do our best, and to be clear, the program is small. Our program is longer, so we work with people for about a year intensely, and we provide everything from identifying the housing they're moving into before they get here, to meeting them at the airport, enrolling people in English classes, employment programs, getting their kids registered in the schools. And Lowell works really well together. The school department and community team works, and the Lowell Community Health Center. We're all partners in making sure that people get the services they need. And that's really grateful, as well as all these mutual assistance associations that have traditionally forever played a huge role in the integration, whether the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association or SADNAR or now the African Community Center. It's a group effort, for sure.
Really, and that's another thing that we see, I think.
Yeah, and the Institute as well has long history and deep roots in Lowell. So even though we're talking about, say, the last 10, 15, 20, 25 years, the Institute was the place that immigrants from Portugal or Greece or Turkey or Lebanon or Quebec or wherever, when they came to Lowell, that was usually the first friendly face people saw to help them settle in. And so there were all these services that have historically been provided. A couple of years ago with some students, we did like a 35 or 40 year retrospective history of the Institute, and it's amazing to see, like in the 1930s, before there was a folk festival in Lowell, the International Institute had a folk festival.
Wow.
And going through the archives, we found all these newspaper articles and 7,000 people at Lowell Folk Festival, and it was basically all these different groups that had been settled that we've been talking about over the last 6 or 7 shows people in their, garb of their country and food and all of that in these really big festivals. And you could, at the Lowell Auditorium or wherever, and summertime things, the Institute had a camp, a real camp, not a camp like the camp that we were talking about a
New
second
England
ago.
proper camp.
And we found pictures in there of Institute employees teaching people how to swim, right? That
Wow.
type of thing, right? And cookbooks. The inventory that we did was full of cookbooks. Every couple of years they would do immigrants cook, and they would have like a recipe from somebody from every country in Lowell. And these cookbooks were, they're like they tell a story of the history of the city in food.
Yeah.
So it's really quite, the archive that's there from the work that was done, again, like way back when, is really brilliant in terms of it being able to, you can look at that and you can see the entire history of the city through the lens of what the Institute has done over 100, like now 100 years.
I mean, we just talk. I mean, it's like it's such an easy statement to say that 100 years ago we started working with immigrant women in the mills, helping them get jobs, get education, get English, acclimate to the community. 100 years later, we're doing the same thing, and in fact, we're still doing it in textiles. One of our greatest partners are organizations like businesses like Southwick that makes Brooks Brothers suits. They hire our clients, and so our clients, when you walk into their plant, it is Syrians and Iraqis and Congolese and Burmese, and so it's the same, and it's the same assistance they need, and so we build on that education and that history of what works well and what can we do differently.
Wow, that's really beautiful that we see after even 100 years, humans helping humans is always what propels us forward. And it's always
Yeah, it works better than the opposite.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And this year we've seen an incredible outpouring of support this year. I mean, between the election and our program was suspended for 120 days, as people know, as the government reflected on the program. But the wonderful thing from that has been just so many people reaching out and saying, I want to make sure that people know I want immigrants in Massachusetts. How can I help? I have these skill sets I want to offer. I know businesses that need, I'm an employer, I want to hire somebody. So we've been really grateful for that.
Lowell really is a unique place when it comes to immigrants and refugees.
And the political leadership in the state too, because when Cambodians were in the refugee camps in Thailand, it was not just, but it was to a measure at least, the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, and his wife Kitty Dukakis, who she in particular took a real important interest in trying to figure out what could Massachusetts do with respect to that population in Thailand in those camps. And so she was very instrumental in sort of creating the linkages and trying to figure out employment opportunities and all those things. And she went a number of times to the camps herself and played a real sort of leading role in doing that. And so there's been that kind of an atmosphere, even though at some other points it can tip the other way. But generally speaking, I think, at least my understanding of the history is, in general, Massachusetts has been more open to the possibilities. And I think people have begun to understand this, as was just said a second ago, the business infusion, the creative infusion, all those kind of things that these new populations bring to breathe new life. And so it's not an accident that lots of times where people are settled were in old mill cities that were declining for any number of reasons. And then you can look back, even though they might not have been welcome initially, you can look back a decade or a decade and a half later, and now people thinking, wow, what would this city be like with these folks not here?
Exactly.
We had an event last night honoring a gentleman who is at Newell, Forrant, who's the president of biotech, he works in biotech and flagship pioneer. But at his remarks, he was saying something that really touched me. He said, entrepreneurship and immigration just goes hand in hand. But the very fact that immigrants have to, when you restart your life or you have to change things, you have to be creative, you have to think differently. And he says that's the kind of infusion we need when it comes to entrepreneurship. It's someone thinking outside the box, trying to overcome obstacles they didn't anticipate. And he said, so he just sees it as part and partial. And we've seen that repeatedly done here in Lowell.
Wow. Yeah, over and over again. And it brings me back to the coffee shops.
Yeah.
Like way back when, what was that, 100 years ago?
Yeah, Greek coffee shops on
Greek
Market
coffee
Street.
shops.
Nice.
And now here we are with biotech companies.
Yeah.
But that's incredible, and it really is the human spirit lives through when you see these people persevering and excuse me, and being these images and symbols of resilience and just create, like you said, creativity and entrepreneurship. Now, can you tell us more about the International Institute and like all of the services, because you guys provide a whole range of services. It's not just resettling refugees, it's also helping other immigrants get on their feet as well. What are all of the services that you provide?
So as an agency across our 3 sites we work with people on every spectrum of the foreign-born sort of population, everything from the refugee arrival who's just come out of their country to, we have a lot of Chinese women in Chinatown that are learning English 40 years after arriving. They've decided, they've either retired and like, okay, I'm gonna learn English. That's really fun. So we think of ourselves as really though primarily focusing on like the first 5 years of arrival for most people. And for refugees, we do provide a whole suite of sort of getting set up services. So that's the housing, that's the appointments and getting people connected to all their basic needs. We do have those skills trainings programs that help refugees and immigrants find jobs or get trained in positions that they're interested in. We just had a fantastic partnership with the Middlesex Community College and the Career Center and the healthcare sector, because we know here in Massachusetts there is a dearth of people and we're going to have a real challenge getting people into that field. So they're reaching out to us saying, are your clients interested? And they are, and they're enrolling in that. We provide employment. Our employment here in Lowell though is employment services, but also English for employment classes that teach you the words to help you get a job.
Oh, wow.
And then we do case management, and then all the way through now we offer legal services to help people get their green cards, and we're also doing citizenship services, which is more important than ever, making sure people get enrolled. We just had the ceremony here in town celebrating, I think it was like 700 new people who became American citizens.
Wow.
And it was so great to be in the audience and look out and see so many of our former clients, and seeing them at that stage of their story. So we see ourselves as catalysts in that. We're small in Lowell in terms of our scale of our program. We really do focus here in Lowell mostly on refugees because Boston is not sustainable for a refugee program in terms of the cost of living there. So Lowell really is where families are coming, and so we meet people here and work with them intensely.
Wow. Now, where are they usually resettled in Lowell?
Where in terms of the neighborhoods?
Yeah.
No, all over.
I was hoping it was going to be the acre.
Basically within, as much as possible, within walking distance or a very short bus ride, because people don't have cars, and they're going to be a while till they get a car. So as long as they're able to walk to us and to the local community health center and be accessible to schools, they're all over.
So yes, the acre is part of it, which has always been a first neighborhood for so many,
That's so
historically
beautiful.
for so many people coming in, but also the Highlands.
Great.
Yep.
Centerville over, I see people walking over the bridge,
For sure.
and I can tell by their garb.
Oh, definitely.
And so you can definitely see in like in my neighborhood in Centerville, definitely people are being settled in.
That's incredible.
And that was largely immigrant Polish neighborhood where I think a lot of people are being settled now up off Lakeview Avenue in that area. So
I mean, the wonderful thing is it's sometimes you can imagine how it's difficult to find housing for a refugee because they're not here. We have to basically ask landlords to open up their hearts and their homes, literally, to people who have not yet arrived, who are not going to have an employment job yet, but we're going to secure them one. So there's all these barriers to trusting. What we find is that a lot of our landlords are former refugees and immigrants who understand that journey and know and believe in our clients that they're going to be able to be good tenants. So we're really grateful to anybody who will work with us in that regards. The 2 biggest gifts that people can give our clients is to be someone who has a job opening or someone who has housing, because those things are critical to someone's journey.
Absolutely. Now imagine we're getting into the colder months. It must be much more difficult to find housing or any kind of shelter. And how swiftly does it happen for these refugees?
So we actually, under a federal contract with the government, we actually have to make sure that they enter housing the day they arrive. So we have no other choice but make sure they are housed. But the challenge is we find out 2 weeks before someone arrives. So it is the hardest part of our work too. And luckily we've got landlords that understand our work and how unique it is. And we make it work. And we have such great community partners. We have a group called Resettle Together, and it's a network of community groups throughout Greater Lowell, not just like as far as like Needham even. People coming up and making sure we have the resources so our families can thrive. And we've got like over 30 community partners. And most recently, last week, a group collected 60 bags of coats and winter jackets and all of these things. So we had a wonderful day outfitting everybody in their warm
The
wear.
first cold day.
They were very happy to have the gloves.
I
So,
bet. Yeah. I wonder how much of a shock it is for some. It must be a huge
Yeah.
culture
My favorite
shock.
is when they still wear the sandals, but then they wear the socks with the sandals.
Oh, yes.
So
Well, I see plenty of American citizens.
I know,
around.
right?
Yeah, somehow it's a good look on some people and then not so good look on other people.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Wow. You know,
So people are settled even in like up in Maine, like Lewiston, Maine.
So that's right. Yeah. So I'm from there. So every state in the country has to participate in the refugee program. So literally, I mean, it's a national program. And so Maine resettles about 250 people annually. Massachusetts resettles 900. This is after the reduction in arrivals, which really, you know, as Bob pointed out, like it's so unfortunate that at a time in the world where there's more refugees, we're making it harder for people to find security. So that's what I struggle with. And then particularly when, you know, again, communities like Lowell have proven to thrive when we've invested in immigrants in our communities.
right.
But
Right, and I think from the president's perspective, continually raising up, you know, that these populations represent these threats and whatever, then makes it more difficult when people arrive. And sometimes I've heard people in Lowell on the city council, for example, talk about hasn't Lowell done enough? Send them someplace else, right? And so, I mean, I understand where people are coming from when they say it, but some of it comes from a lack of knowledge and information about the difficult circumstances people have been in. And I think sometimes I feel like if more people in Lowell actually got to see what life was like in one of these places where refugees have been living for 20 or 25 years, they would be more willing and more open. I like to think that anyway, to actually figure out, isn't there even more that we could do? Because in all instances, people are in this situation not by choice. Right? I mean, immigrants came here in the period that we've been talking about earlier. Not all, but a good many of them came by choice to look for economic opportunity or to escape religious persecution or whatever it is. But a lot of the people that end up in the circumstances we're talking about today are there because of a conflict that had nothing to do per se with who they are, and in order to like have their kids live another day or another week or another month, they realize they need to go, right? And so right away, it's not the same sort of circumstance. And I mean, when I'm teaching this stuff at the university, I try to impress that upon the students that I have, that there are differences in, I mean, one of them can have grown up in Lowell, graduate, and decide they're going to move to California, right? I mean, that's one way that people move, but that's entirely different than, you know, having your village be invaded by whomever and you flee for your life in the middle of the night. That's not the same.
It's not. It's not. But over all of these 200 years, and we see this quota system repeating itself a little bit again, but we also see humans helping humans, and that's really why we survive as a race of humans, right? Yeah. And Lowell historically has been one of those places that can be a sanctuary for these people, and hopefully we remain that going forward. So thank you so much, Cheryl, for being on this show today, and thank you, Bob, again.
Pleasure, as always.
And I think one thing that we need to remember is that those of us who study history know that we're doomed to repeat it, because there are a whole bunch of people who aren't studying history.
We want to repeat it. We want to repeat it, the better parts of it.
Exactly.
And skip over the bad parts.
Yeah, let's skip over the bad parts. Let's be a community of people who helps other people. Thank you so much for tuning in.